Hey, what's up everybody? And today I'm going to be showing you how to get started with After Effects. After Effects can be a very daunting program, especially if you've used other programs like Photoshop or Illustrator just because it's so different than those programs. After Effects is even different than Premiere, even though they're both kind of timeline editors. This one is a lot more visual focused, and you have things lacking like audio or something like that. So to get started, we need to start talking about panels. And if you haven't used another Adobe program, then this will be a new concept, sort of, kind of. Panels are basically these things. So, like, this is the project panel, the effect control panel, composition layers. Over here I have info, audio, preview, character. At the bottom I have my timeline. It's the composition panel. There's no composition created right now, so it's just none. What panels are the way to use the Adobe After Effects or the Adobe suite in general. Every single program has panels, and each one of them has a specific objective. You can find and remove, add panels from the Windows key. All the ones with check marks are currently showing somewhere in After Effects right now, whether it be like behind or whether it be right next to one. They're in After Effects currently. The ones without check marks are not, and if you want one, just click on it and it will go ahead and open it. For example, there we go. Down low, I just click the Libraries tab, and now Libraries is now part of my panels. One of the cool things about After Effects and about all of Adobe's programs is that the panels and the workspaces are completely and totally customizable. So if I don't like the composition, the view right here, I can grab it, I can move it over to the left, I can move it back, I could create a new one on the left here, a new panel, I could add it to this one. I can really just do anything I want. So as I develop as a programmer or a video maker, I can really learn and set up Adobe the way that I want. And you can also drag it off and onto the right screen. So you can't see that here, but this is on my other monitor right now. And I can drag panels over to another monitor, another two monitors, and really set it up so that I can use multiple monitors in the most efficient way possible. A lot of people actually take their timeline, wherever that went, and they will bring it over onto another screen so that they can see it on that screen and then only work with the visuals on one screen. Now, over here are the presets for these panels. Essentials is basically the default preset. I'm going to click Reset to save layout, and it's going to rebuild what we just started at, which is great because you can move stuff around, and if you really don't like it or you lost a panel or something like that, you can always reset back to the beginning. And there are different panel presets that come with After Effects, and then you can create your own. So if you want a preset for color correction or you want a preset for keyframing or something like that, you can create the preset, go to it, and then just switch in between them really quickly, like so. So now that we have a good understanding of what Adobe After Effects kind of looks like, how we can manipulate the view space, let's get started. The first thing we need to do is import some footage. There's so many different ways to do this in After Effects. We're going to go into the Project tab right here. We're going to right click, we're going to click Import and File, and then I'm just going to choose a file from one of my recent trips to Japan. So I have the file now in the project over here. The next thing we need to do is we need to create a composition. It makes it very easy by just taking it and dragging it down to the timeline right here. It's going to create the composition with everything and all the settings specifically formatted for this footage that you put in. If, however, you wanted to create a composition on your own, maybe you wanted to adjust some of the settings, you can go into New Composition, under Composition and then New Composition, and you'll be presented with this dialog, which has a bunch of toggles and switches to create a new composition. These are very specific to what you want to be doing with the project. So if you come to the New Composition tab, you're probably going to have an idea of what you want to change. If you don't really have an idea of that, I would just take the footage and drag it over. So we have our composition set up, and now let's move on to actually talking about what a composition is. A composition is a grouping of assets and footage into a certain timeline. Compositions are helpful because if you have really, really large files, like 100 plus layers, and a layer is this right here, so we have one layer here right now. If I were to go to Layer, New, Solid, and add a solid, that's a second layer. So these are 2 layers. You could have hundreds of these things, and I think there is a max, I don't know the number, but you have a lot of room to work with. So that would get very, very sort of disorganized if you put it all into one composition. And it would take forever if you're trying to edit, for example, all of the text on a screen, or you're trying to edit just this one scene and all of the assets that were tied to that scene. So what you do is you create compositions. They're almost like folders, but you can apply effects to compositions like you can to footage, and it'll apply to the effect to everything in the composition. So as well as with organizational purposes, compositions are great for doing wide sort of effects to a large portion of your project. Right now though, we only have one piece of footage in our composition, so we only need one. And what we're doing is we're editing inside the composition right now. If we were to just quickly create another composition here, you see how it's empty? We can drag that other composition into here. And this is the composition, the first one that we created. And if you see, I created a composition that has 720p. So this box is showing you that the composition right now that I added to it is too large. So it's going to be zoomed in. I could zoom it down, I could zoom it up. But the main part is, if you see, this is now a composition with a composition inside of it. And this composition could have 12 compositions, and then you could extract that up another layer and have 20 compositions inside that composition. It can go on and on and on. So right now, though, just understand a composition is a grouping of footage that really helps us get organized and allows us to affect large portions of the project. So I'm just going to go up to Comp 1 and delete that one. That's the one we just created for the example. We're going to go back into this composition, and now we are back to our footage. Down here you have the timeline. The timeline is the essence of what After Effects is. It's a timeline editor, but it's a motion graphics sort of visual timeline editor. So if we scroll over here, we have our footage, and as you can see, this is doing adaptive resolution, which allows us to scroll as fast as possible, because unlike Premiere or other programs, it's not going to let us view it in full time, because it's going to render everything as high definition as possible. So if I click spacebar over here, the spacebar is to play your footage. You can go up to preview and you can click play here as well. The shortcut is also right there. Where I'm going to go ahead and drag this down so we just see the top right here. If I click spacebar, you'll see that right now it's playing at full speed. And this line right here went green. This is your RAM preview. What RAM preview is that every time you click the play button, it's going to render out, and to render means to finalize almost the effects in it. So it's going to take all of the footage and the math and the data, and it's going to make it into an image. And the green line means that it has already been done, that it's been created and it's sitting inside of your computer's RAM right now, which means it can be accessed almost instantaneously and it can play at full speed. Because this composition is only a solid and my piece of footage, and I have an extremely powerful computer, it'll always play at full speed. However, if you have a more complex composition or a more complex project in general, or a smaller or less powerful computer, then it might take a little while to render. So when you click a button, it's going to, up here in red, it'll say being played at 22 frames a second or 14 frames a second. It's going to play slowly because it's going to have to render those frames out before you see them. So After Effects, in that sense, makes it a bad video editor because it's very hard to see transitions and stuff like that when it's always playing at a slower speed than normal. It's meant to do this because it's having to render out extremely complex graphics, and it just can't play it in real time. If you add motion blur and all these different effects to it, there's no way it can play it in full time, and so it tries to slow it down so that you can actually get a sort of a view of what the effects are going to look like over time. So if it ever slows down or anything like that, just check out the green down here. You might have to just let it play through once, and it'll kind of go through and it'll save all those files into your RAM until it gets maxed out. Then it can't save anymore. Then if you go back to the beginning, you can play it in full time because those files have already been rendered out. The next thing we need to talk about, and a very important aspect of the Adobe After Effects, is masking. Masking is basically the art of deleting or cutting out a piece or a shape from an object so that you can put it into another object. In this sense, I'm going to just show you. Click on the shape tool up here. It's going to create a shape, a mask shape on the solid that we have selected. I drag the black solid up so I could have that one selected. You can just click on it to have it selected. I'm going to have black solid. I'm going to start up here. I'm just going to drag down to the other corner. Doesn't have to be perfect. Make this a little bit bigger so we can see it. Okay, so now I just cut out the ends, the sides of this. So it's saying whatever inside of my mask, keep. I, however, don't want it to add whatever in the mask. So I'm going to go down here into black solid, and if you click this arrow, it's going to open up the settings. The next one down, it might have it closed, is masks, and these are the properties that are attached to this layer. So I'm going to click masks, and then now I have mask 1, that's the one we just created, and I'm going to go to the drop down and hit subtract. And now it's going to invert what that does. So whatever inside of that box, delete and keep everything else. Now that I have this inverted, you can see it's almost like we're looking through a telescope or something like that around the edges. And to create this effect, we're actually just going to make some small modifications down here in the properties. So the first thing we need to do is we need to now go into the properties of the mask and go into feather. And what feathering does is it blends the pixels. So right now we have a harsh edge. Anything past this is pure black. Anything past this point on the bottom side is whatever's beneath it, which at this point is the footage. If we feather that, it's going to split that. So everything past this point is going to go from the footage to the black over a certain period of time. So it's going to keep adding a little bit of black until we hit our final black up here. So if we add a big feather to this, you can see that now it actually looks like maybe a little bit more realistic telescope because they usually don't have really hard lines around the edges. However, that's not the effect we're going for. We can go into the transform tool on this black solid, and then we can subtract the opacity right here, which the opacity is how transparent the image is, or the inverse of that. So if you have 100% opacity, it's completely opaque or completely not see-through. You can't see through it at all. So it's just an image. So it's the pure blacks. However, if you go down to 0, it becomes 100% clear and it's like it isn't even there. We're going to drag this maybe around to 30%. And what we just created is called a vignette. And it's designed to focus your eyes on the center because the edges are dark, so you're going to look towards the light. And it's a very subtle effect, but it can really add a cool cinematic appearance to your film. If you want to see what it looks like before or after, go down to this little button right here, and you can see before, after, before, after. This shows, it's the show button, the view button, so if you click it, it'll make that scene disappear, and it'll just go back into the background. This checkered pattern means there's nothing there. Come back, I have my footage, make this disappear. You can do anything. You can click and drag all the way down. Oops. Click on one, drag all the way down. You can turn everything off or everything back on. Really great to see an effect kind of isolated so you know how it's working. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to learn about the Effects tab. The Effects tab is really what makes After Effects After Effects. It is the combination of effects that you can put in together in so many different ways, and you can get really creative with these things and simulate different things. You can make muzzle flashes, you can make explosions with different assets, you can make lights and blending. There's just so much you can do with it. And if you want to see some really cool things you can do with it, go to videocopilot.net or .com with Andrew Kramer, and he is like the master of After Effects, and he can show you some of the really cool things you can do with effects. However, we're just going to use a really simple effect, and that is going to be the tint effect. So if we just went and searched tint right here, the tint effect comes up under the color correction panel. If we drag it, now this is where you have to be careful. If I drag it here, it's going to be applied to the black solid, because currently the black solid is a full image solid and it's above our footage. So we're dragging it onto whatever layer is on the top. And that can be a problem, especially if you have effects that you added at the beginning and you don't really want to touch them anymore. You could accidentally add some effects and, get confusion in there. So we can do this one of two ways. We can take the tint and drag it down to this file down here, and now it applies. Or we can just lock the footage here. Locking the black solid means it's no longer applicable. See how it doesn't let me select it? It double clicks, telling me that it's basically unselectable. And I can't add or subtract anything from it. So if I drag right now, it's like that solid isn't there. The layer can't be touched anymore, so it goes to the next layer, which is our video footage. Once the tint is applied, we can now go over to the Effect Controls panel on the left here, and you can see the effect being activated right here. Tint, what we just added, and then its properties. If you want to make them go away, always the arrow. This tint is a very simple effect. It just maps it to black and white, and then you get to control what the black and white is. If you don't understand an effect, usually the names can tell you, but if you don't know what's going on, click and drag things. Try to figure it out. I mean, that's the best way to learn it, just to experiment. What happens if I change this color? What happens if I do this? So the amount to tint, as you can see, goes from basically nothing, like the effect isn't there, to a full black and white tint, or to a full tint to whatever these two colors are. So if I made this map to white red, we now have a strong red tint. But maybe if we drop that off and just put it in like 16%, now it could be a color correction or a color grading sort of tool. After Effects, however, is centered on the idea of keyframes, which is the addition of effects over time. So you don't just want very static sort of effects. After Effects is great at making an effect that moves, that goes with the film, that simulates real life. So to do that, we're going to use keyframes. Keyframes are basically a part of every single piece of this program. The easiest way to get a keyframe started with an effect is to click the stopwatch, and it will start the keyframe. Now, wherever you click the stopwatch, it's going to create an instance of that at the given setting at the given time. So if I click right here, now at 0 seconds, the tint is going to be at 16%. And since there are no other keyframes, it's just going to remain at 16% the whole time. Now if I move up to 3 seconds, and I move it all the way up to 100%, now a keyframe sort of sequence is activated. And it's going to go from 0 to 100% over time, because we have 100% here and 16% here. So if you click, you can just watch your effect be activated. Now, if you want to edit the keyframes or you want to manipulate the keyframes, click the drop-down menu, go into the Effects tab, which has been created when we added an effect, our effect that we want to manipulate, and as you can see, here is our keyframe. The exact same three properties up here are now down here in our timeline, so we can see them in a timeline view. And now we have keyframes active. Now notice, the color change is always going to be the same because a keyframe hasn't been activated for that. So if I change it to blue here, it's not going to go from red to blue. It's just going to be blue now. However, if I activate the keyframe here, and then I go to the end, and then I switch the color, we're going to have a transition from blue to red over time. So it's going to start off, and it's going to get deeper as well. And so now we have the transition. So the keyframe has to be active to have the transition, and it's only going to be active for the property that you have it selected in. You can manipulate these keyframes. I could highlight, drag it on back, and now this effect is a lot quicker. And then maybe, since both of them are selected, since both of them have keyframes, I can just manipulate this. Now I want it to go to green and pull the tint back off just a little bit. So now it'll go in, come out, and then back. If I hold Control while clicking them, I can round out these keyframes. So instead of going and then immediately transitioning back, it'll go and then it'll slow down as it approaches. Sort of like if you threw a ball in the air, it'll keep traveling up, then it'll slowly stop, and for a second it'll just be almost levitating, and then it'll slowly start to accelerate back down towards the earth. That's what the effect's going to do. which isn't very noticeable in something like this, but if we made it a little bit longer, you might be able to see how it hangs there just a little bit longer than it might if it doesn't, if there weren't those circles. There's a couple different keyframe abilities you can add to them. Some stopwatches where it'll go really slow when it gets near and then really speed up afterwards. Those are pretty advanced, but just for now, understand what keyframes do and how to use them in your project, how to use them in After Effects in general. We can also add some text to this piece of footage or this composition really easily with the text feature up here. You click the text, you just drag out a text box, and you can get started. Just type in whatever you want to type in, and now the text is added. If we want to manipulate the text, there are effects to manipulate the text. So for example, I'm just going to type in TY right here, and the Typewriter Effect is one that I like to use because it's very good at just having text come in. I can drag that on down here, and now it's going to apply this isn't an effect as much as it is a preset because it's manipulating variables that are already there just in a way that helps you. So for example, you can see now that it types it out. But we see that the Effects tab hasn't been activated yet on this text element. And that's because the preset, what it did was at wherever my timeline was, it went down in the text, then it went down into the animator, down into the range selector, and it just selected right here that the end will be at 100%, or that right here the start will be at 0%, and then the start will be at 100%, which just animates the text because there's nothing written and then 100% of it is written. So I can grab this and I can bring it really close now, manipulate this preset, and then now it just types it really, really quickly. I could also do the inverse and I could drag it out, or I could make it come in and then just come back out really quick. Unlimited possibilities with all of this stuff. If you want to experiment, it's always so easy just to hit the drop down menu and just look at what's going on here. And then just, like I said, drag and manipulate. So scale, now it's really big. Control Z, great tool to undo. Rotation, whoops, that's how many times it's rotated. Rotation right here. Rotates around the anchor point, and that comes to an important thing, which is you see this text element. What if I wanted to rotate it in? We have the problem that if I went into the transform panel here and I tried to rotate right here, it's rotating around that crosshair right there, that anchor point. Okay, so let's grab the anchor point and move it. Anytime I try to click it, it moves the whole composition with it, or the whole asset with it. So what we can do is we can go right up to here, hit the pan behind tool, and basically the pan behind tool is, in parentheses, the anchor point tool. It's used to grab anchor points and move them. So I can grab this and get it, relatively centered. If I hadn't rotated, it would have been a little easier. Get it centered, and now when I hit the rotate, it rotates on that point. Maybe I want it to come out of the top left. I can just set the anchor point up there. I could also type in stuff up here. So if I wanted to set an anchor point to a specific point, I could type it in, and it's going to set the anchor point to that point. And then it's going to redo all the other effects in relation to that. So there the rotate is, and now it rotates really far around that anchor point, like it's a big circle right there. After Effects has a lot of neat tools like this. The pen tool is used for masking and keyframing. So if I wanted to click on, so I'm going to always remember to close these out so you can see what we're doing in your timeline. So now we want to edit into the footage. So if I wanted to, I don't know, cut this out right here, just a really basic sloppy cut, bring it around, and now I can create basically the same thing I did with the shape tool, but I can create a custom shape. And these things can be manipulated with keyframes as well. That's how you cut an object out of one frame and you put it into another one. How you quote unquote Photoshop something in a video is that you have to keyframe frame by frame over someone, and then move one frame forward. Which if you go to the preview, this is the next frame button, and then re-keyframe, next frame button, re-keyframe. It's a very time-consuming process, but if done right, you can cut something out and put it into another one. Adobe also has tools to make this a lot quicker, but sometimes you do actually just have to keyframe stuff. Now, the last thing we need to talk about to learn After Effects, we're going to Control Z back to the normal. We don't need this, is the idea of parenting and null objects and stuff like that. So down here you have the switches are basically what they can be called. They're a bunch of little effects that you can apply, but they're very, very large little effects, if that makes any sense. They affect the project as a whole almost. So if I click this, oh, that one's locked. See, it won't let me do it because it's supposed to not be moved. If I click this, this is now a 3D object. So it's a little change, but it makes a world of difference. So now it has an X, a Y, and a Z. So if I rotate this, you'll see that it rotates like it's in 3D space. Like it's now a postcard or something. Like, I don't know, maybe a video game, you're picking this up. But yeah, so that's what that button does. Makes objects into 3D, so if you're manipulating stuff in 3D space. This is frame interpolation. It's used so if you try to slow down footage, it's going to try to guess the frames that aren't there and make your slowed down footage, your slow-mo footage, look better. If you use it with like a green screen background, you can make things go so slow because there's nothing interfering. But in a scene like this, if I tried it, I'd get bubble effects everywhere. Then you have the adjustment layer effect. Effects applied to this layer apply to the composite layers below. So anything you apply to now Japan will be applied to everything beneath it. Or you can just go create new adjustment layer. And if you can see it's already selected, it's just a blank solid that you can do the exact same thing with. But if you had a video clip and you wanted everything beneath it, you could click that button. So then, parenting. Parenting means that whatever happens to one asset/layer happens to the next one, whichever one it's parented to. So if I took let's say I took a new layer and I made, let's go with Japan. So we're going to take this Japan file right here. We're going to go down and we're just going to make a quick edit to it. Go into Animator. We don't want it to delete again. So it's just going to write itself out. And then unrotate it too. So then we're going to re-rotate it back in, grab it, and we're just going to stick it right here. So now that it's here, we can use something called the tracker. And the tracker, null pointers, parenting, all kind of comes together. So if we click on the footage, we can track the camera, track motion from this point. And if we use a track point, this is where After Effects gets very helpful. So if I wanted to track, let's say, you have to find a high contrast area that's not going to move. So I'm thinking right here maybe. If you see in movies and stuff, that's why they have the big dots on them, or people use a piece of green tape. I bet you that right there will be perfect. Something that's so different from the scene that you can track it, and then the trackers can just remove it later. Inner box is what it's going to search for first. The outer box is the maximum area it will search. If you make the inner box too big, it will take forever to actually accomplish, but it might be more accurate. However, if the inner box covers another color that is that box, or even if the outer box does, it could jump and you'll lose your track. Really simple. We're just going to click Go. And as you can see, that box didn't move, so we had a perfect track there. So now, let's get into layers. We're going to create a new null object. A null object, for a computer science term here, null meaning like nada, zip, nothing there. It's literally an object that has nothing. It has no properties. It has no visual elements. It is nothing. However, null objects are great to store information. So it starts out with nothing, but we can now edit the target and select our null object. Click OK. And then apply our track to the null object. X and Y dimensions are fine. So now our null object follows that point precisely. So you see right there, now it sticks to it perfectly. So now we have our null object with the data. If we then parent our text element to that null object, our text element will now follow the scene. So as you can see, it's perfectly tracked into the scene, and it looks like almost it's a part of the sidewalk. It's a little bit off because I'm tracking an element that's farther away in perspective. So what moves here, it's going to move slightly slower there, but you get the idea. This is a track, and this is parenting. So we tracked a position in the scene. We then applied that data to a null object. Then the null object had our data for the scene. It has a good idea of how it should adjust its X and Y to stay in position with the scene. Then we parent the object to the null object. So we parented the text to the null object. So now the text will do whatever the null object is doing. And since the null object is doing whatever the scene is doing, we now have a perfect track like that. And then wait until it slips right there because the tracking was ended at that point. Now, you might ask, why didn't we just apply the effect or the tracking data to, let's say, our text? Why didn't we just do that? That is because what happens if we wanted to include, I don't know, bullet holes, or we wanted to cover up something, or we wanted to include other effects and assets into the scene? If we only apply it to one layer, that one layer is now going to be the only layer that is tracked, and we'll have to keep retracking, or we'll have to parent layers to that layer, and that can get really dangerous because if you move one layer, you could end up messing up everything in your scene because everything is parented, so everything will move with it. So if we just have a null object, that specific goal is to, whenever you need something planted in the scene attached to me, then we can get a really good track on the scene. So that is After Effects basic tutorial. We went from everything to looking at it to tracking, and this is a great place to start. The best way to learn After Effects, in my opinion, is to just experiment. Try out new things, get some footage, and just try adding effects to it. Try replicating something you see online. Try your hardest, because After Effects can only be learned through practice. I learned it by making videos with my friends, VFX videos. At the beginning, the effects were horrible, but as I learned over time, I slowly got more and more efficient at After Effects, and my effects became better and better. It's like any other skill. You just have to practice with it, and you'll get better. I hope I helped you guys with this, and good luck in your After Effects and your video editing careers. And until next time, guys, see ya.